Daniel Mercer was not a man who made small decisions. Everything he did was big. His office on the 42nd floor of Mercer Tower, his black car that waited outside every morning, and the way he walked into a room like he already owned it. He had built his company from a small logistics startup into one of the most powerful shipping and supply chain corporations in the country. By the time he was 38, he had more money than most people could count. He had connections. He had power. He had a name that people respected. But he also had a wife. Her name was Sophia Harrington. She came from old money, the kind of wealth that did not shout. It simply existed. Her father, Raymond Harrington, had built Harrington Group over 40 years. It was a quiet empire, real estate, private banking, and a dozen companies that most people had never heard of, but whose products they used every day. Sophia had grown up in that world. She wore simple clothes, spoke in a calm voice, and never once talked about money in a way that made others feel small. Daniel had married her 6 years ago. At the time, people on both sides had whispered. Some said Daniel was marrying up, that he wanted Harrington connections to grow Mercer Corp faster. Others said Sophia was too soft for a man like Daniel, too gentle, too quiet. But the two of them had seemed happy enough in those early years. They had a home in the hills. They traveled twice a year. They appeared at the right events and stood beside each other in photographs. The cracks, however, started long before anyone could see them. Daniel had a way of making Sophia feel invisible, not through shouting or anger. He was too controlled for that. It was the small things. He would cancel dinner plans without calling. He would take calls during their private time and wave her away with one hand. When she shared ideas at company gatherings, he would smile and quickly change the subject. When her father invited them to family events, Daniel would go only if it served some business purpose, and he would leave early without explanation. Sophia tried. She arranged his schedule, supported his work, and stood quietly at his side through every public event. She never complained to her father. She never told her friends what was happening. She simply kept going, kept adjusting, kept hoping that things would shift. They never did. By the 5th year, they were more like two people sharing a calendar than a married couple. Daniel came home late. He traveled more. When they were in the same room, the silence between them was heavy. Sophia would sit at the kitchen table in the morning with her coffee, and he would walk past without looking at her. Then one afternoon, Daniel called her into his home office and told her he wanted a divorce. He did not look sorry. He did not ask how she felt. He placed a folder on the desk between them and said that his lawyers had prepared everything. He told her it was better for both of them. He told her she would be comfortable. There was a settlement included. He said it in the same tone he used during board meetings, clean and final. Sophia looked at the folder. She looked at him. Then she nodded, picked up the folder, and walked out of the room. She did not cry in front of him. She would not give him that. The divorce was handled quickly. Daniel's team had prepared everything in advance, which told Sophia that he had been planning this for some time. The settlement he offered was fair by ordinary standards: a house, a monthly payment, and a lump sum. But Sophia did not touch the settlement money. She signed what needed to be signed, moved her things, and left without a single public statement. Daniel, meanwhile, felt something he had not expected. He felt relief, at first. He told himself that he was free now, free to focus fully on business, free from the quiet tension that had filled their home. He went back to work with energy, took 3 back-to-back meetings, and had dinner with 2 investors who had been circling a new deal. But within a week, something shifted. The business world, which had always been generous with Daniel, began to feel different. Meetings that he expected to close did not close. A partnership he had been building with a European firm suddenly went cold. 2 of his senior directors resigned within 10 days of each other, giving polite but thin reasons. His assistant told him that 3 of his biggest clients had asked about the situation at Mercer Corp, which meant word had spread, though Daniel was not sure exactly what word. He told himself it was a coincidence. But then his calls to Raymond Harrington went unanswered. This was new. Raymond had always picked up. Even after Daniel had married Sophia, Raymond had been respectful and open. He had never pushed Daniel into anything, never used his daughter's marriage as a business lever. Daniel had actually appreciated that. It made him feel like Raymond respected him as a businessman in his own right. Now the silence from Raymond's office felt loud. Daniel asked around carefully. He reached out to a mutual contact, a man named Arthur Wells who had known Raymond for 20 years and moved easily between both their worlds. Arthur had lunch with Daniel and was honest in the way only old men in expensive suits can afford to be. Raymond knows everything, Arthur said simply, cutting into his steak. He always does. The question is not what he knows. The question is what you plan to do about it. Daniel asked what there was to do. The divorce was done. Sophia had agreed. It was legal and finished. Arthur set down his fork. Raymond is not upset about the divorce, Daniel. He is upset about how you treated his daughter for 5 years before it. There is a difference. Daniel drove home that evening and sat in his car for a long time outside his building. He had always believed that in business, what mattered was the result. The process could be rough. Negotiations were rough, decisions were hard, and not everyone walked away happy. That was simply how the world worked. But for the first time, sitting alone in his car, he began to wonder if he had made a serious mistake. Not the divorce itself. He still believed that was the right decision. But the 5 years before it. The ignored dinners. The canceled plans. The cold silences. The way he had treated a woman who had never once raised her voice at him. Sophia had been decent to him in every way. And he had treated her like a piece of furniture. Present, useful at times, and easy to ignore. He went upstairs and poured himself a drink he did not finish. He opened his laptop and looked at the Mercer Corp financial reports, but the numbers did not hold his attention. He kept thinking about the folder he had placed on the desk between them. He kept thinking about the way she had picked it up, nodded once, and walked out without a word. He had expected her to argue. He had expected tears, maybe anger, maybe a call from Raymond that same evening. He had braced himself for some kind of scene. But there had been nothing. Sophia had simply left, quietly and completely, the way she had always done everything. And somehow, that quiet was louder than anything she could have said. Daniel did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark and thought about Arthur's words. He thought about the calls from Raymond going unanswered. He thought about the deals going cold and the directors leaving. He was not a man who scared easily, but for the first time in a long time, something felt uncertain beneath his feet. The next morning, he made a decision. He picked up his phone, scrolled to a number he had not dialed in several months, and pressed call. The phone rang 3 times. Then a calm, firm voice answered. Raymond Harrington. Daniel sat up straight, the way he always did before an important meeting, and said the words he had spent all night preparing. What he said next would change everything, not just for him, but for Sophia, for Raymond, and for every person connected to the quiet world the Harringtons had built so carefully over 40 years. Raymond Harrington answered the phone the way he answered everything, with patience and no rush. He had built an empire by listening more than talking, and he was not about to change that habit for anyone, including the man who had just divorced his only daughter. Raymond, Daniel said, and for a moment, nothing else came out. Raymond waited. That was the thing about Raymond Harrington that most people underestimated. He never filled silence with his own voice. He simply waited, and in that waiting, the other person almost always said more than they had planned to. Daniel had known this about Raymond. He had seen it in business meetings. But knowing a tactic and surviving it were 2 different things. He cleared his throat and said what he had rehearsed in his dark bedroom the night before. I called to apologize, Daniel said. Not for the divorce. For the years before it. I was not a good husband to Sophia, and I understand that. I am calling because I want you to hear it from me directly. There was a pause on the line. Not long, maybe 4 seconds. But to Daniel, it felt much longer. I appreciate that, Raymond said. His voice gave nothing away. Daniel pressed on. He told Raymond that he had not called to ask for anything in return. He was not calling to save a deal or repair a business relationship. He was calling because he had spent the past week thinking, and the thinking had brought him to an uncomfortable place, a place where he could no longer tell himself a comfortable story about the kind of man he was. Raymond listened to all of it without interruption. When Daniel finished, Raymond said simply, "Come to the house on Saturday. Have lunch with me." Daniel agreed immediately. He spent the next 4 days trying to understand what that invitation meant. It could be a closing door, a final, polite meeting before Raymond quietly removed Mercer Corp from every Harrington-connected circle. Or it could be something else. He could not read it, and that bothered him. Daniel Mercer was good at reading people. He had built a career on it. But Raymond Harrington was not most people. Saturday came and Daniel drove himself to the Harrington estate in the countryside outside the city. It was a large property, old and well kept, with trees that looked like they had been standing since before Daniel was born. The house itself was traditional, stone and wood, nothing flashy. No gate guards, no cameras visible from the road. Just a long driveway, and, at the end of it, Raymond standing outside the front door in a plain sweater, like a man waiting for an old neighbor. They sat in the garden, and a quiet woman brought out food without being asked. Raymond poured the tea himself. For the first 30 minutes, they talked about almost nothing. The weather, an old building in the city that was being torn down, a book Raymond had been reading. Daniel tried to find the right moment to say something meaningful, but Raymond seemed in no hurry to get there. Then, without any clear shift, Raymond put down his cup and said, "Tell me what you actually want, Daniel. Not from me, from your life." The question caught Daniel off guard. It was too simple and too large at the same time. He thought about it honestly, perhaps more honestly than he had thought about anything in years. He talked about the company, about the work, about the satisfaction of building something. But as he talked, he could hear himself, and he noticed something. Every answer he gave circled back to achievement. There was nothing in his words about connection, nothing about people, nothing that was not, in some way, about winning. Raymond nodded slowly. "You know what Sophia told me when she was 12 years old," he said. "She told me that the saddest thing in the world would be to spend your whole life being successful and never once feeling at home anywhere." Daniel said nothing. "She was 12, Raymond repeated quietly. She saw it even then. In people around her. In the world. The conversation stayed with Daniel long after he drove back to the city. He could not shake the image of a 12-year-old Sophia watching the adults around her and already understanding something that most of them would never admit to themselves. Meanwhile, Sophia had moved into a smaller apartment in the city, not because she could not afford something larger, but because she had chosen it. It had 2 bedrooms, good light, and a balcony that looked over a quiet street with trees. She had spent the first week after the divorce sleeping long hours and eating simple food. She had not spoken to many people. She had told her closest friend, a woman named Grace, only the basics. Then she had started working. This was something Daniel did not know, something almost no one knew. For the past 2 years of their marriage, while Daniel had been traveling and working and filling his calendar, Sophia had been quietly building something of her own. She had used a portion of her personal savings, money from her own trust, completely separate from Daniel or the Harrington Group, to invest in 3 small companies. A sustainable packaging firm, a woman-led architecture studio, and a small healthcare technology company that was developing tools for rural clinics. None of these were flashy. None of them had made headlines. But all 3 were growing, and growing well. Sophia had kept this entirely private during the marriage. Not as a secret kept out of distrust, but because she had learned, slowly and painfully, that when she shared things with Daniel, he either ignored them or quietly redirected the conversation back to himself. So she had simply stopped sharing. She had found something that was entirely hers, and she had held it carefully. Now, post-divorce, she was more focused than ever. She had meetings in the mornings, calls in the afternoons, and in the evenings, she cooked her own meals and read. She was not pretending to be fine. She actually was fine, in that real, quiet, hard-won way that only comes after a long time of not being fine. Her father called her every few days. He did not bring up Daniel. He asked about the companies, about the packaging firm's new contract, about whether the healthcare startup had found the additional funding it needed. He treated her work with the same seriousness he gave his own, which meant everything to her. On one call, Raymond mentioned, without any particular weight, that he had spoken to Daniel. Sophia was quiet for a moment. "How was he?" she asked. "Thinking," Raymond said. "Which is new." She almost smiled. She did not ask for details and Raymond did not offer them. That was their way. He would tell her what she needed to know, and she trusted his judgment about what that was. What Sophia did not know was that Raymond, after that Saturday lunch in the garden, had placed 2 quiet phone calls. One was to a man on the board of a European firm that had recently gone cold on a deal with Mercer Corporation. The other was to a real estate group that had been reviewing a contract connected to Mercer's expansion plans. Raymond did not ask these men to do anything. He simply talked about Daniel, about the phone call, about a man who had driven himself to a house in the countryside to say sorry for something that had no business benefit whatsoever. Raymond let them draw their own conclusions. Because Raymond understood something that Daniel was only beginning to learn. In the real world, not the world of contracts and quarterly reports, but the actual world where people made decisions about who they trusted. Character was the only currency that never lost its value. You could rebuild a balance sheet. You could restructure a company. You could survive almost any financial mistake. But if people decided you were not worth trusting, no spreadsheet in the world could fix that. Daniel, sitting in his apartment one evening, received a call from the European firm. The tone was warmer than it had been in weeks. They were open to reconsidering the timeline, they said. They had heard good things recently. They hoped to move forward. Daniel thanked them and put down the phone. He sat for a long moment. He had not asked Raymond for help. He had not asked anyone. And yet something had shifted, not because of a deal or a favor, but because of a Saturday afternoon in a garden and an honest conversation that had cost him nothing except his pride. He pulled out a piece of paper, not his phone, not his laptop, but actual paper, and he wrote down 2 words at the top. He stared at them for a long time. Then he wrote a name beneath them. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Mercer did something he was not used to doing. He sat with uncertainty. He did not try to solve it or manage it. He simply let it sit. Outside his window, the city moved and buzzed and lit itself up against the dark. Somewhere across that city, in an apartment with good light and a balcony with trees, a woman he had spent 6 years ignoring was working quietly towards something of her own. Neither of them knew what came next. But the space between them, which had once been cold and empty, was beginning, very slowly, to feel like something else entirely. 3 months passed, and in those 3 months, Daniel Mercer changed in ways that were small and slow and not at all dramatic, which is exactly how real change happens. He started arriving to work 30 minutes later than he used to. Not because he was lazy, but because he had begun using that early morning time to sit with his coffee and think without a screen in front of him. He started asking his team how they were doing and actually waiting for the answer. He promoted a young woman in his logistics division who had been doing exceptional work for 2 years without recognition. He called his mother, who lived 3 hours away, and visited her on a Sunday, something he had not done in almost 4 years. These were not grand gestures. Nobody wrote about them. No one would ever call them a comeback story. But they were real, and they were his. At Mercer Corp, the business slowly steadied. The European deal moved forward. 2 of the 3 clients who had gone quiet came back. A new partnership opened with a supply chain firm in Southeast Asia, one that Daniel landed not through old connections, but through his own work. He flew out, met the team, learned about their process, and spent 3 days listening before making a single proposal. He came home with a signed agreement and a feeling he had almost forgotten, the feeling of having earned something cleanly. He thought about Sophia more than he expected to. Not with longing exactly. At least, he told himself it was not longing. It was something closer to regret that had softened into understanding. He would be in the middle of something ordinary, eating lunch, reviewing a contract, standing in an elevator, and a memory would come. Sophia at breakfast, her hands around her coffee cup, her face turned toward the window. Sophia at a company dinner, listening carefully to someone whom everyone else in the room had ignored. Sophia handing him his coat on a cold night outside a restaurant, saying nothing, just making sure he was not cold. He had taken every single one of those moments for granted. He saw that clearly now. It did not feel good to see it, but it felt necessary. Sophia, during those same 3 months, had closed the first significant funding round for the healthcare technology company. The number was not enormous by the standards of the world she had grown up in, but it was real and it was hard-won. She had sat across from investors and made the case herself, not with her father's name, not with Harrington Group behind her, but with data and preparation and the kind of calm confidence that comes from believing in what you are saying. The packaging firm had landed a contract with a national grocery chain. The architecture studio had won a design competition for a community center in the south of the country. All 3 of her investments were moving. Grace, her closest friend, noticed the change in her. "You seem different," Grace said one evening over dinner. "I am different," Sophia said simply, and left it at that. She was not bitter about Daniel. She had looked at that bitterness when it came. Looked at it honestly, the way her father had always taught her to look at difficult things, and she had chosen not to carry it. It was heavy, and it was not useful. She had put it down. That did not mean the hurt was not real. It was. But she had decided that the hurt belonged to the past, and the past was not where she was living anymore. It was Raymond who brought them back into the same room. He did it with characteristic simplicity. He was hosting a small private gathering at the Harrington estate. Not a party, just dinner for 12 people, a mix of old friends and newer business contacts. He invited Sophia. He also invited Daniel. He told neither of them that the other would be there. This was not manipulation. Raymond Harrington was too careful a man for manipulation. It was something more intentional, a quiet belief that some things needed to happen in person, in a room with good food and honest air, rather than through messages and managed conversations. Sophia arrived first. She was wearing a dark blue dress, and her hair was pulled back simply. She moved through the gathering easily, speaking to people with the natural warmth that had always made her good at these things. When Raymond greeted her, he held her hand for a moment and looked at her carefully, the way fathers do, checking something only they can check. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she told him. And she meant it. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. He saw her from across the room before she saw him. She was talking to an older couple near the window, laughing at something the woman had said. She looked settled. She looked like herself, more like herself, perhaps, than she had in years. He stood still for a moment. Then Raymond appeared at his shoulder. "She's doing well," Raymond said quietly, without looking at Daniel directly. "I can see that," Daniel said. "That is her own doing," Raymond added. "Not mine." Daniel nodded. He understood what Raymond was telling him. When Sophia turned and saw Daniel, she did not freeze. She did not look away. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she gave a small, calm nod, the kind that means "I see you, and I am not afraid of this," and went back to her conversation. Daniel felt something move in his chest that he could not name. They did not speak until dinner was nearly over. Raymond, in the way of a man who arranges the world around him with great care and no visible effort, had seated them near each other without placing them beside each other. Close enough to speak, far enough to choose not to. After the meal, when people were moving toward coffee and the conversation had loosened, Daniel walked to where Sophia was standing near the garden doors and said, quietly, "You look like you're doing well." "I am," she said. "I'm glad," he said. And then, because he was a man who had spent 3 months learning how to say honest things, he added, "You deserved better than I gave you. I know that now. I should have known it much sooner." Sophia looked at him carefully. She was not moved to tears. She was not cold either. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they once carried and have since put down. "I know you mean that," she said, "and I appreciate it. I don't expect anything from saying it," he told her. "I just needed you to hear it." She nodded slowly. "I hear it." They stood together for another minute or two, not in the tense silence of their marriage, but in something quieter and less weighted. They talked briefly about her companies. Daniel asked about the healthcare startup with genuine curiosity, and when she explained the rural clinic tools, he listened the way he had not listened to her in years. He asked a good question. She answered it. It felt, for a moment, like two colleagues who respected each other. Then other guests came, and the conversation moved, and they drifted apart naturally. On the drive home, Sophia sat in the back of the car and looked out at the dark road. She felt something she had not expected to feel, not warmth toward Daniel, not regret, not anger. She felt something more like completion, like a long chapter that had been sitting open on a desk had finally, quietly, been closed. She did not want him back. She knew herself well enough to know that. But she also found, to her own surprise, that she did not want him to fail. She wanted him to become whatever he was trying to become, not for her sake, for his own. Daniel, on his own drive home, thought about something Raymond had said to him months earlier in the garden. He thought about Sophia at 12 years old, already understanding what it looked like when a person spent their whole life being successful and never once felt at home anywhere. He thought about his own apartment. Clean, expensive, quiet, efficient, everything in its place. He thought about what home actually meant. And then, in a moment that surprised him completely, he thought about the piece of paper still sitting on his desk at home, the one with 2 words at the top and a name written beneath them. He had not acted on it. He had not known how. But tonight, something had settled in him. Tonight, he had looked at the person he had hurt most and had spoken the truth without any plan or strategy behind it. And it had cost him nothing except a moment of discomfort. And it had given him something he could not quite describe, something that felt, very distantly, like the beginning of being at home in his own skin. Raymond Harrington, the last to leave his own gathering, stood in the garden long after the cars had gone. The night was still and cool. He looked up at the sky the way men his age sometimes do, counting things that cannot be counted. He had not fixed anything. He knew that. He had simply created a small, careful space where two honest things could happen. What happened next was not his to arrange. It belonged to them. But Raymond Harrington had lived long enough to know one thing with certainty. When people finally stop performing and start telling the truth, even if it is too late, even if nothing comes of it, something in the world becomes, by exactly that much, a little more right. He went inside and turned off the lights. The estate settled into silence. And somewhere across the city, two people who had once shared a life and had since found their own separate ones were sitting, each alone, each thinking. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them was pretending.